Hey everyone! So today I'm going to be bringing back a series that I started doing a while ago. If you've been following me from the beginning, you probably remember 4 strange and random things you probably didn't know. Probably also may have noticed, or not, that I made a lot of my old videos private, and it's basically because I went through a lot of my old videos and I realized that they were really bad. And I am just so grateful for all the people who have stuck by me this long and the people who are subscribing now, because honestly my content really wasn't that great. You know, I'm no Mr. Ballin. Unfortunately, that purge included all of my 4 random things you probably didn't know because I just didn't like them, to be honest. So I'm gonna revamp it and we're gonna start all over again. So today I'm gonna be telling you guys about 4 strange and random things you probably didn't know. First off, we're going to start by talking about the story that was the inspiration behind Fastball's very popular song, The Way, that came out back in the 90s. I can almost guarantee that everyone has heard this song, even if they weren't around in the 90s, because it's just a popular song, and I'm sure a lot of people sang along to this one-hit wonder without even realizing what the song was about. And once I tell you what the song is about, you probably won't be able to hear it the same ever again. In 1986, in a town called Salado, Texas, a woman named Leela and a man named Raymond met each other when they were both in their 70s. They had a lot in common though. They both loved the same music, they were both widowed, and they both had grandkids. The two of them crossed paths and they fell so deeply in love that they decided to get married. And every year they would take a little trip from Salado, Texas to Temple, Texas, which is only about a 10 to 15 minute drive, for the annual Fiddling Festival. How cute is that? By 1997, Raymond was 88 and his health wasn't doing too good because he had suffered a stroke. Leela was 83 at the time and she had been showing early signs of dementia, but despite all this, they still hit the road that year for the annual Fiddling Festival in Temple, Texas. A few days later, Tony Scalzo, who is the frontman of Fastball, was reading through a newspaper when he came across a headline that said, "Elderly Salado couple missing on a trip to nowhere." It appeared that Raymond and Leela never made it back from the Fiddling Festival and the police were now looking for them. Over the next few days, Tony became very invested in this story and he would often wonder who was this couple and where were they going without ever knowing the way. So he sat down and started writing lyrics for The Way, and eventually it became a very popular song. Tony was really hoping deep down that the couple just decided to run off together and make a whole new life. Unfortunately though, just a few weeks later, Raymond and Leela's bodies were discovered in their car at the bottom of a canyon in Hot Springs, Arkansas. They were discovered by a group of teenagers that had been walking along a ravine. Tony would finally finish the song after he learned the fate of the couple, but the weird thing is, and something that no one's really figured out to this day, is how or why they got all the way to Hot Springs, Arkansas. It's about 400 miles away from their destination, which was in Temple, Texas. And I mean, Leela was showing early signs of dementia, but no one can say for sure if it was an accident or if they meant to do that. Tony was pretty shocked when the song basically topped the charts at the time. He was not expecting it to get as popular as it did, but he was even more surprised when Raymond and Leela's family reached out to him. When they heard the song and saw the video, they knew exactly who the song was about, and they actually really liked it, and he was really happy about that. Number 2 on my list today is to discuss the murder of Dave Navarro's mother. In 1983, Dave was 15 and he was living with his mom in California. His mom was a beautiful woman named Connie Colleen Hopkins, who modeled and even had some TV appearances at the time. Now, when Connie started dating a guy named John, he was really cool and everybody liked him at first. But after a while, it became clear that John was not the man that he had portrayed himself to be. Connie ended up ending the relationship, but according to her friends, she was scared of him and she was very paranoid, and Dave started getting these daunting feelings that his mother was gonna die. I'm sure almost everybody has had that feeling, like something awful is gonna happen to one of your most beloved friends or family, but rarely do these things ever happen. But unfortunately, it happened to Dave on March 3rd, 1983. His biggest fear came true. When Connie broke up with her boyfriend, John Riccardi, he didn't do what most normal people would do, which is go deal with your shit somewhere and deal with the pain and get over it. Instead, he decided he was going to murder Connie, and that's exactly what he did. On that fateful day, March 3rd, 1983, John would shoot and kill Connie along with her best friend, Susan Marshall Joy, in a West Los Angeles condominium. He went on the run and wasn't found for almost a decade, but in 1991, a viewer of America's Most Wanted had seen him on the show and called in with a tip that eventually led police to him. 3 years later, John was sentenced to death, and at 76 years old, he was the oldest person on California's death row, up until 2012 when some court shit ended up making it so he would have life instead. During that decade that John was on the run, Dave had started playing guitar, and eventually he was touring the world with his band Jane's Addiction. He always had this deep-rooted fear, though, that John was going to find him and kill him just like he killed his mom. And this fear ended up manifesting itself into a really bad heroin addiction that almost killed Dave a number of times. Luckily, Dave was able to pull himself out of that horrible addiction, and he lived to see the day that his mother's murderer went to prison. He continued playing music, and he also became a really popular judge on the hit show Ink Master. There's a really interesting documentary about this case called Morning Sun. I think you can find it on Pluto TV. I'll leave the link down in the description box if anyone is interested. Coming in at number 3, I'm going to be talking about Sam Kinison's last moments and his last words. On the night of April 10th, 1992, comedian Sam Kinison was driving his Trans Am from California to Nevada so that he could perform at a sold-out show. Sam's new bride, who he had just married 6 days prior, was in the passenger seat. Behind them, driving in a van, was Sam's brother, his best friend Carl LeBeau, and Sam's dog. All of a sudden, a very drunk 17-year-old kid in a pickup truck was coming up fast in the opposite lane. Sam saw this coming, and he managed to slow down quite a bit before the 17-year-old crossed over the middle line and hit Sam in a head-on collision. Sam's wife ended up being perfectly fine, and it appeared that Sam was going to be fine too. Although he wasn't wearing a seatbelt and he did hit his head on the windshield when the collision happened, he ended up between the two seats in his car, and besides that and a couple of cuts, he seemed like he was going to be fine. But according to his friend Carl LeBeau, when he walked up to Sam, he witnessed Sam talking to someone who wasn't there. According to Carl, Sam said, "But why?" And then he paused, like he was listening to someone who was responding to him. And then he said again, "But why? I'm not ready to die yet." And then he would stop and listen again, like someone was responding to him. After listening to this unheard voice for a couple of minutes now, Sam finally said, okay, as if whoever he was listening to had comforted him enough and talked him into dying. And he died right there on the spot. It turns out that Sam actually did have a list of serious internal injuries from the accident, and all efforts to resuscitate him failed on the scene. He didn't even make it to the hospital, and he was only 38 years old. Coming in at number 4 on my list, last but definitely not least, is the murder of Glen Brittner. Now, I know some people have a slight addiction to watching the show Hoarders. I know I do every now and again. I could watch Hoarders for hours. But there's one episode in particular that was really popular because of a man named Glen Brittner and his rats. Glen was on the 3rd season of Hoarders in 2011 when he was 54 years old, and he talked about his wife, who was the love of his life. Unfortunately, though, she had passed away a few years prior. As a coping mechanism for Glen's grief, he started raising rats as pets. Unfortunately, though, the rat population got way out of control, and they started overrunning his house, and that's why Glen had to reach out to the show. He knew that the rat population had grown out of control, and all he really wanted was for his rats to be collected safely and given to good homes. Hoarders was able to save Glen and thousands of his rats, but unfortunately, 4 years later, Glen was murdered. Glen's murder came as a shock to literally everybody because Glen was such a nice and sensitive guy. He missed his wife and he loved his rats, and he didn't bother anybody, so why would anyone want to kill him? In 2015, Glen was nearly 60 years old and living alone in a multi-acre Antelope Valley home where he had also ran his business, a domestic water delivery service. But on August 18, 2015, Glen was the victim of a home invasion. Hours after the home invasion, Glen was found by one of his employees with his hands and feet bound by zip ties. The wheelchair that he had been using was nowhere to be found, and he had severe head trauma. When he was discovered, he was still alive but in critical condition and unable to speak. After about 10 days in a coma, Glen would unfortunately succumb to his injuries and pass away. The authorities say that they believe 2 men invaded Glen's home that day, and they stole $2,000, a couple of TVs, and some power tools. Unfortunately, they have never been caught, and Glen's case is still open to this day. And on that note, that basically wraps up today's video, guys. So if you found this video interesting, please give me a thumbs up and let me know. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, I leave all of my social media and any links I found interesting while researching this video in the description box below if you would like to check any of that out. So I hope you guys have a great night, and I'll see you soon.